A child was born in a galaxy that had already forgotten him. He didn't know it. No one did. But his name would haunt the Force for generations. This is the story of Darth Wredd, the last Sith born. He wasn't born into power, not into wealth, or violence, or bloodlines. He was born into silence, into a time when the Sith were myths, ghosts of war-torn centuries, spoken of only in Jedi texts and political warnings. The galaxy had moved on, but the dark side had not. His true name was never recorded. The place of his birth lost in the wreckage of Imperial collapse. What little remained of the Sith had gone to ground, fractured, scattered, unspoken. But they whispered still, in cults, in corners, in broken voices clinging to ancient rituals. And somewhere in that shadow, a boy cried out for the first time. He wasn't chosen. He was claimed, not by family, not by love, but by those who believed the Sith must live even if the Sith themselves were gone. They found him young, perhaps too young to remember his own mother's face. To him, the red robes and pale masks were all he ever knew. They fed him falsehoods like lullabies. The Jedi had murdered his ancestors. The Republic had erased his bloodline. And he, nameless, innocent, voiceless, was their final hope. They gave him a name that didn't belong to him. They called him Sith, not with the honor that title once held, but with desperation. The galaxy was too vast, too bright, too safe. They needed a weapon, a vessel for the vengeance they could never deliver themselves. So they built one. His earliest memories were of silence, endless halls without windows, harsh voices in the dark, no toys, no sunlight, only symbols carved in stone, whispered in sleep, painted in blood. He was told he was powerful, but power, to him, meant surviving another day without kindness. They never taught him truth, only doctrine, the rule of two, spoken like scripture. But no master, no apprentice, just empty repetition. He recited names he'd never understand. Bane, Revan, Sidious. Each name delivered with trembling reverence. Each legend weighed down with stories of conquest and betrayal. But Red knew none of it. To him, it was bedtime noise. He wasn't trained like the Jedi trained. He wasn't guided like the Sith once guided. He was shaped like metal in fire. Each failure was punished, each emotion suppressed. They didn't want a student. They wanted a shadow, and so he became one. By the time he could speak clearly, he'd already learned not to. By the time he could read, the only words he knew were Sith oaths. And when he first touched the Force, trembling, frightened, unsure, they beat the fear out of him. Fear was weakness. Anger was strength. Loneliness was necessary. They never told him what love was. Only that it made men weak. Only that it had killed the Sith before. So he buried the feeling even when it came. Even when he looked at the stars and felt something stir, something fragile, something curious, he locked it away. Because they were always watching. Because he was not a boy, he was a weapon. And in time, he would forget there was ever a difference. The ones who raised him were not Sith, not truly. They wore the robes, they spoke the language, but they were hollow. Pretenders wearing the skin of something ancient, broken remnants of the old order clinging to rituals they no longer understood. They called themselves loyalists, keepers of the last flame. But what they kept wasn't fire, it was ash. Red was raised by these men and women, but not loved. They didn't believe in love, only obedience, only control. They moved from system to system, always in hiding, never staying long. Ruins became their temples, Caves became classrooms. He slept beside statues of Sith lords whose names were lost to history. Their cracked stone faces stared down at him, night after night, silent, cold, and unknowable. And slowly, he became like them. They taught him fear first, not of others, but of failure. Mistakes brought pain. Hesitation brought punishment. Kindness was treated like betrayal. He was given no real name, no birthday, only a title, Child of Wrath. Every lesson was a warning. The Jedi would come. The galaxy would forget. The Sith would die, unless he made them remember. They spoke of Darth Wredd with burning reverence, a shadow from a century past. They called him the last true Lord. They whispered that he had been betrayed, that his one Sith had scattered, that 1,000 cowards now wore the name unworthy of it. Red didn't understand. He was too young to grasp the scale of what had come before. He only knew what they told him, that he was the last chance, the last heir, the last Sith. So he believed them. He learned to fight before he learned to read. Old blades, primitive forms. There were no lightsabers here, only salvaged tech, broken hilts, and dreams of glory. But his anger made up the difference. He was never taught the Force gently. There was no meditation, no balance, only pressure. They pushed him to lift stones, crush bones, bend will. They watched his eyes for failure. And when he screamed, they smiled. One day, a girl appeared, older than him, maybe 15, silent, wounded. She didn't speak his language, but her presence changed something. For a brief time, Red was not alone. They trained together, ate together. He saw kindness in her, curiosity, things the loyalists told him to fear. She called herself Lysa. And when she touched his arm one night gently, wordlessly, he felt something break open inside. Something human. The next morning, she was gone. No explanation, no farewell. Just a cold room, an empty bunk, and silence. He asked where she'd gone. They told him she had failed. That failure had no place among the Sith. He never spoke her name again, but he never forgot her touch. From that day forward, Red hardened, not just in body, in heart. Every time he felt doubt, he remembered the girl. Every time he felt mercy, he remembered what mercy cost. The cold hands that raised him had won, but they didn't realize what they had created. He wasn't becoming a Sith. He was becoming something else. Not a warrior, not a disciple, not even a believer. He was becoming an echo, a reflection of what the Sith used to be, twisted by memory, shaped by fear. And deep inside him, the rage was growing. Not against the Jedi, not against the Republic, but against the ones who made him believe they were Sith. The ones who chained a child to an identity not his own, and told him to carry it alone. They told him he was a Sith long before he understood what the word meant. To Red, it was not a title, not a destiny. It was a weight placed on his shoulders before he could stand on his own. The Loyalists had nothing left of the old empire. No holocrons, no living masters. Only broken fragments of teaching passed down through fear and misunderstanding. They didn't teach Red what the Sith were. They taught him what they needed him to be. A symbol, a tool, a weapon pointed at a galaxy that had already moved on. He heard the name Darth for the first time during a ritual in a ruined fortress. The air smelled like dust and rusted iron. Torches flickered against walls carved by hands long dead. He stood alone in the center of a ring of masked followers, every face hidden behind cloth and breathless expectation. The leader stepped forward, robes dragging across stone. "Someday," he whispered, "you will take the mantle. You will restore the darkness they stole from us." Restore, reclaim, revive. Words spoken with reverence, but empty of meaning. Red didn't understand the history behind them. He didn't know about the rule forged by Bane, the war that killed Revan, or the hunger that consumed Nihilus. He had no concept of the deep tradition he was being forced to inherit. He only knew he wasn't ready. But no one cared. Every failure was treated as betrayal, every hesitation seen as weakness. And the more they demanded strength, the more he began to fear the power he was supposed to command. His abilities grew, but his understanding did not. Force pushes without purpose, bursts of anger without guidance, whispers of instinct he could not control. He learned pain first, discipline second. Understanding never came. Sometimes he heard voices in the Force, faint impressions of something older, colder, watching him. But whenever he tried to ask, the Loyalists silenced him. Questions off a Jedi, they snapped. Sith obey. And so, the darkness inside him grew without shape. He wore the identity they gave him like a mask, heavy, suffocating, too large for his face. A title without lineage. A destiny without truth. One night, during meditation, he saw something. Not a vision shaped by the Loyalists. Not a memory. Something deeper. He saw a figure, armored and silent, standing at the edge of his mind. The shape was familiar, though he had never been taught its name. A towering silhouette marked with ancient scars. Darth Wredd, not as a teacher, not as a guide, but as a shadow, a reminder that the Sith had once been real, and that Red was not. When he opened his eyes, he felt smaller than he had ever felt. The Loyalists were not preserving the Sith. They were imitating ghosts. He began to watch them differently. Their trembling hands, their desperate faces, their obsession with a legacy they didn't understand. He realized they feared him, not because he was strong, but because he represented their last lie. The more he grew, the more they tightened their grip. Restrictions, surveillance, punishments for questions he no longer asked aloud. And slowly, the word Sith began to lose meaning. If they were Sith, why did they hide? If they were Sith, why did they fear the Jedi so deeply? If they were Sith, why did they need him? He understood then. They needed the title more than the truth. They needed the illusion more than the legacy. He was their story, a myth they could point to, a future they could claim. But Red felt nothing when he spoke the words. No pride, no belonging, only emptiness. The name they forced upon him was a hollow shell, a promise he never made, a mask he never asked to wear. And as he grew older, one truth became impossible to ignore. A hollow name can crack, and when it does, something real breaks free beneath it. It didn't happen in battle. It didn't happen with lightning or screams. It happened quietly, in the dark, when no one was watching. The moment Red changed, he had no grand revelation, no vision in the Force. Just a feeling heavy, familiar, unshakable. The sense that he was alone, and that he had always been. The Loyalists had begun to fear him openly now. They no longer called him Child of Wrath. They no longer touched his shoulder after training. They spoke in corners, whispered instructions when they thought he couldn't hear, watched him like he was something they couldn't control. Because he was. Not stronger than them, not smarter, just separate. Somewhere along the path, he had stopped belonging to them, and they had noticed. One morning, he awoke to silence. The camp was empty, his belongings gone. No footprints, no note, no explanation. Only a single message burned into the dirt with a blade. You are ready. It wasn't a gift. It was abandonment dressed as praise. They didn't believe in him. They were afraid of what he might become. So they left before he did. For a long time, he sat where they had left him, hands on his knees, eyes forward, waiting for the feeling to pass. It never did. They had trained him to fight, to channel rage, to embrace solitude. But they had never taught him what to do when the silence became real, when it stopped being a lesson and became his life. He wandered for days, sleeping in caves, drinking from rusted pipes, searching through old cargo ruins for pieces of what he might be. And the galaxy gave him nothing. Not kindness, not cruelty, just silence. Eventually, he found a derelict starship buried beneath vines on a jungle moon. Inside, bones, dust, a flickering console. The ship had belonged to a bounty hunter long dead, but the weapons were intact. So were the datapads. He read them, not because he was curious, but because they were the only voices left. Stories of contracts, skirmishes, encounters with Jedi, mentions of warlords, of the one Sith, and finally, a name. Darth Wredd. It was more than a name now. It was a thread, the first real connection Red had to something outside the lies he'd been fed. He read everything, watched what remained of the footage, and realized the loyalists had lied about everything. Wredd hadn't been betrayed. He had been defeated. Not by Jedi, but by time, by his own children. The one Sith had fallen, not with glory, but with infighting, ambition, madness. Red sat in that ship for 3 nights, reading the same lines over and over. We are all Sith, we are none of us alone. And he laughed, not with joy, not with scorn, but with something sharp, something that lived in the cracks of his mind. The truth wasn't that the Sith had died. It was that they had never truly lived by the code they claimed. All his life he had been told what he was, what he had to be, what he had to carry. And now he saw the truth. There was no path to follow, no legacy to uphold, only fragments. He wasn't the heir to anything. He was a mistake, a consequence of people who couldn't let go. And yet, in that moment, he felt something ignite, a flame, not of hope, but of clarity. He would not serve their memory. He would not wear their mask. If he was to be Sith, he would decide what that meant, and he would walk that path, alone. Red never knew peace. He was born in the aftershocks of war, but he never heard the explosions. He only felt the silence that came afterward. The galaxy called it healing, a time of rebuilding, a fragile calm held together by treaties, Jedi patrols, and the last broken pieces of a once shattered republic. But Red saw none of it, because no one saw him. The Jedi had returned to Coruscant. The Galactic Alliance had resumed its councils, and star systems once drowned in blood now spoke of unity. They celebrated the fall of Darth Wredd. They whispered that the Sith were finished, that the last shadows had been cleared. They were wrong, not because Red was a threat, but because they didn't care to look beneath the surface. He wandered from moon to moon, a silent, drifting presence among people who never asked his name. He took work where he could, cargo lifting, station repairs. Sometimes he just slept in alleys, watching transports disappear into the sky. No one stopped him. No one saw him. To the galaxy, he was no different than the millions displaced by war. Just another scar on the face of peace. Just another orphan of empires. And in a way, they were right. He had no purpose. No teacher. No past worth speaking aloud. The loyalists who raised him had vanished into history. Their names forgotten. Their rituals meaningless. What remained was hunger, a burning inside him that never faded even when he tried to bury it. He didn't use the Force openly, but it never left him. Sometimes, without thinking, doors opened before he touched them. Sometimes people stepped aside without knowing why. And sometimes, he saw things, flickers of memory that didn't belong to him. Visions of red sabers, of starships burning in orbit, of a masked figure walking alone through the ruins of Ossus. He didn't understand what they meant, but they followed him, like ghosts. He watched the Jedi on HoloNet broadcasts, distant, formal, celebrated. He watched them speak of justice, of recovery, of a future without fear. He felt nothing, not envy, not hatred, just distance. They had the power to change everything, and they let it break instead. They ignored the children hiding in forgotten systems. They missed the cold worlds where Sith teachings still festered. They never looked for the boy who had been trained in the dark because they didn't believe he existed. That ignorance kept him alive, but it also broke something. Red didn't want revenge. He didn't want to fight the Jedi. He didn't even want to be seen. He just wanted to understand what he was, and why no one had ever come for him. He was neither hunted nor welcomed, not feared, not needed, just forgotten. And in that forgetting, something deeper formed. A silence too old to name. He moved like a shadow, a being shaped by a war he never witnessed, carrying lessons passed down by voices already dead. He walked through spaceports where Jedi once fought Sith. He sat in cantinas where bounty hunters once served empires. He stepped over the bones of history and wondered why they still called it peace. Because for him, nothing had ended. The war lived in his blood. The teachings still echoed in his sleep. And the galaxy, for all its unity, had no place for someone like him. He wasn't a Sith. Not yet. Not fully. But he was already something they didn't understand. And when the galaxy forgets what came before, it never sees what's coming next. Red's path didn't follow trade routes or populated worlds. He drifted toward the places most people avoided. The forgotten, the buried, the places where empires had died and no one bothered to clean the bones. He didn't seek danger. He sought answers. Ruins had a way of speaking when people didn't. The first world he found was a shattered moon once used by the one Sith. Its surface was cracked from ancient bombardment, and the air held the taste of old fire. He walked across fields of broken durasteel, stepping over collapsed training grounds where acolytes once shouted their oaths. Now they were silent. The galaxy had erased the one Sith from its memory, but the ruins refused to forget. Red touched the stone remains of an old fortress. The cold sank into his fingers. He felt the echo of something violent, a pain that didn't belong to him. It passed through him like a whisper, leaving his hands trembling. For a moment, he wondered if the stories he'd been told as a child were true. If darkness still lingered here, hiding beneath layers of dust. But the feeling faded before he could understand it. He stayed in the ruins for 3 nights, not searching for relics, just listening. And every night, the wind carried fragments of voices. Laughs, screams, commands shouted long ago. Or maybe they were only memories of the Force impressions left behind by those who died with their passions unburied. He couldn't tell. From the ruined moon, he traveled to a planet once scorched by Mandalorians. Entire cities lay untouched since the war, metal towers collapsing under their own weight. Streetlights still flickered in abandoned districts, powered by generators no one had shut down. He walked through them quietly, watching his reflection in cracked glass. The boy he saw there had nothing to do with the Sith he'd been promised he would become. No armor, no saber, no destiny, just a young man searching for himself in the wreckage of others. He found an old battlefield next one, where Sith troopers had made their last stand against Galactic Alliance forces decades earlier. The ground was littered with rusted armor, still marked with the red paint of Krait's empire. He knelt beside one helmet, brushing away dirt. A skull stared back at him through the visor. He didn't recoil. He felt something else. Recognition. As if he were looking at the future someone had planned for him, a life ending in battle for a cause he didn't believe in. He walked away without touching anything more. Every world he visited taught him the same lesson. Everything built on fear collapses. Everything fed by hate rots. Everything raised in darkness leaves behind only silence. Yet the silence didn't comfort him. It made him feel smaller. The loyalists had claimed he was the heir to a legacy. But in these ruins, he saw the truth. There was no legacy left. Just ghosts trapped in metal and stone. He spent weeks among these graves of empires, sleeping in starships that no longer flew, meditating in halls where Sith lords once commanded armies. Not once did he feel the guidance he'd been promised. Not once did he hear the voice of the Force calling him toward destiny. The Force did speak, but not to him. It spoke of endings, of failure, of what ambition becomes when left to rot. By the time he left the last ruin behind, Wredd understood something he'd never been told. History doesn't make Sith. Pain does. Loneliness does. Understanding what the galaxy refuses to see does. He didn't rise from these broken worlds with pride. He rose with silence in his heart, and the silence was beginning to feel familiar, comfortable, necessary, as if something inside him was waiting to wake. Wredd didn't know what to do with his power. He had no master to guide it, no enemy to unleash it against. No vision of the future to shape it. He had been trained to serve a Sith order that no longer existed, raised for a war that never came, forged for a cause that had already died. And now, he was alone with it. In the absence of purpose, instinct took over. He trained himself, not for war, but for control, not to destroy, but to endure. He lifted stones with his mind until his muscles ached. He practiced breathing beneath the weight of pressure until his ribs trembled. He slowed his heartbeat, sharpened his reflexes, not because he expected battle, but because battle was all he understood. There were no lightsabers in his hands, just scraps, metal rods, shattered components. He studied the hilts of fallen warriors, piecing together how they were built, how they were held, how they were lost. But still, he never lit one. Not yet, because lighting a saber meant being seen. And he wasn't ready to be seen. The Force lived in him like a storm behind glass. It pressed against the edges of his mind, whispering when he slept, tightening when he felt pain. Sometimes he pushed people without touching them. Sometimes he caught objects before they fell, before he even realized he'd reached for them. And sometimes he let the pain speak. He would sit alone in abandoned bunkers or darkened tunnels, letting the weight of memory settle on his shoulders. And when he finally allowed the rage to surface, the earth would tremble, walls would crack, the air would thicken, and the silence would return heavier than before. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't hate it. It was just part of him, a reflex, a consequence. He watched the galaxy try to move forward. New elections, new Jedi, new laws passed by people who had never seen war up close. And none of it meant anything to him, because behind every peace treaty was a forgotten child, and behind every celebration a ruin left untouched. Red wasn't angry at the Jedi. He wasn't even angry at the Loyalists anymore. His rage had shifted, narrowed. It wasn't personal. It was structural. He hated the emptiness. He hated the way the galaxy treated the Sith as fiction, as legends, as something to be studied, not understood. They spoke of the rule of two like a myth, of Darth Bane like a warning, of Darth Krayt like a failed experiment. But they didn't speak of the consequences, of the orphans made by war, of the worlds forgotten by peace, of the shadows that still breathed between stars. He wasn't building an army. He wasn't forming a plan. He was surviving, and in survival, the Force continued to grow, more instinctual, more precise. He could hear the shift in someone's heartbeat before they drew a weapon. He could sense lies through tone. He could tell when someone was being watched. He was becoming sharper, not as a Sith Lord, but as a blade without a hand. And deep down, he began to suspect something. He was not waiting for a master. He was not waiting for a call to action. He was becoming something that didn't need either. He was a weapon without a war, and weapons like that don't rust. They don't retire. They don't disappear. They endure. Until someone decides to use them, or until they decide to be used no longer. There was no ceremony, no title, no witness. When Red became Sith, he did so in silence. He didn't kneel. He didn't swear an oath. He simply accepted what he already was. Not because of doctrine, not because of legacy, but because he was the last one left. The galaxy had moved on from the Sith. The Jedi refused to speak their names aloud. The Alliance hunted down the last surviving agents of Krayt's empire and called it justice. But beneath the surface, in the cracks between hyperlanes and memory, the dark side had not vanished. It had simply lost its voice. And Red, quiet, forgotten, unclaimed, had nothing else to speak with. He stopped calling himself anything. No alias, no false name. He didn't need one, because no one was asking. He wore scavenged armor, not ornate, not marked with symbols. Just black plating pieced together from a dozen dead soldiers. Functional, cold, anonymous. He carved a place for himself on a derelict station orbiting a gas giant. A forgotten relay node from the days of the Empire. It had no crew, only flickering lights, a half-working transmitter, and enough power to keep him breathing. Here, he meditated. Not the way the Jedi did with serenity, and not the way the Sith once did with dominance. He simply listened. To the hum of the station, to the static of the Force, to the truth inside him. The truth that he had never been meant to survive. That his life had been shaped by people who needed a story more than a student. That he had been told what to be, before he was ever allowed to choose. But now, there was no one left to choose for him. He began constructing a lightsaber, piece by piece. Not from tradition, not from ceremony, but from fragments he had gathered on ruined worlds. He didn't care about color. He didn't care about crystal purity or focusing rings. He just wanted it to function. It was ugly, unrefined, but it answered to him. And when he first activated it, the red blade lit the station walls with a slow, steady glow. It didn't roar. It whispered, a hum that matched his breath, a presence that reflected his own. He stared at it in silence, then deactivated it, and said nothing. He didn't take a Sith name, because names were for those who needed to be remembered. And he didn't. He was not Darth Wredd yet. He was not feared, not hunted, not known, but he was ready, not to conquer, not to lead, to walk forward, alone, into a galaxy that refused to believe he existed. He wasn't like the Sith of the past. He didn't seek domination. He didn't dream of empire. He didn't want to restore the Sith. He wanted to correct them. He wanted to be something they had never been. A Sith who didn't lie to himself. No codes, no dogma, just truth. And the truth was simple. He had no place in this galaxy, so he would make one. Not by claiming power, but by surviving in spite of it. The galaxy didn't need another war. Not yet. But it would remember what it tried to forget. Because Wredd was still here, breathing, watching, becoming, and when the time came, he would not speak like the Sith of old. He would act, alone, without permission, without prophecy, because sometimes the most dangerous Sith is the one who doesn't need to be called Sith at all. It began with a transmission, distorted, weak, buried beneath encrypted trade traffic on a forgotten frequency. Wredd hadn't been listening for voices, but the Force drew him to the sound, a voice from his past. Older, bitter, familiar. He didn't recognize the words at first, but he recognized the tone, the weight of control behind it, the way it didn't ask, only expected. The voice called him Child of Wrath, a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to a boy who had been lied to, broken, molded, used. Wredd traced the signal to a derelict freighter orbiting a dead star. It was barely holding together, a shattered hull kept alive by failing droid systems and one functioning life support node. Inside waited the man who had once claimed to be his master. He had no name. The Loyalists called him Overseer, but Wredd had only known him as voice and pain. The one who demanded, the one who punished, the one who whispered ancient titles with no soul behind them. The man had aged, thinner now, weaker, but still wrapped in the red robes of a tradition neither of them believed in anymore. When Wredd entered the chamber, he didn't speak. He didn't bow. He didn't ignite his saber. He just watched. The Overseer smiled, thin, desperate. "You survived," he said, as if it were a compliment. "As you were meant to." Wredd said nothing. The man rose from his chair, slow and shaking. His hand hovered over an old cane, not a weapon, not anymore. "I knew you would come," he said, "because you still need purpose." Wredd blinked once, then stepped closer. "You abandoned me," he said quietly. "No," the man replied. "I freed you." The room was quiet. Only the hum of dying engines filled the space between them. "You were never meant to be a follower," the Overseer said. "You were meant to lead. That's why we trained you the way we did. Why we broke you. Why we—" "You lied," Wredd cut in. Not loud, not angry, just certain. The Overseer paused. "You said I was the last," Wredd continued. "You said I was heir to the rule of two. You said you were preparing me for the truth." "I was," the man insisted, voice rising with desperation. "But you weren't ready. You had to be shaped. And now look at you, strong, whole, powerful. You are the Sith." Red stepped forward, not with fury, but with finality. "You are not my master," he said. "You never were." The overseer looked at him, eyes filled with fear and something else. Pride. Delusion. "Then take your place," he said. "Finish the cycle. End the old. Become what I made you to be." There was a silence. Long. Heavy. Red didn't hesitate. His blade ignited with a hiss barely louder than his breath. The red light painted the walls, the robes, the face of the man who had claimed to own his future. The strike was quick, clean, no rage, no cruelty, just release. The overseer fell without a sound, and the ship, for the first time in years, felt still. Red stood over the body, not triumphant, not transformed, just quiet. He hadn't killed a master. He had buried a lie. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. Not forward, not upward, inward. The body was still warm. Red didn't look at it again. He didn't need to. The moment the blade passed through flesh, the truth became clear. His training had never been about survival. It had been about containment. The loyalists never wanted him to rise. They wanted him to stay where they put him beneath them. Even the name Sith had been used as a chain. Not a calling, not a right, just a word to trap him in their image. They hadn't taught him the Force. They'd taught him fear. Not fear of death, fear of himself. Every lesson had been built around the idea that he could never be trusted alone. That he needed guidance, that he would fall without structure. But the truth was simpler. They were afraid of what he might become if they let go. Red searched the chamber, not for weapons, but for records. He found a cracked terminal beneath a broken wall panel. Old voice logs, fragmented teachings, names he didn't recognize. All of it was noise. Stories designed to make the loyalists feel like they were part of something larger than themselves. Pretending to follow Crate, pretending to honor Bane, pretending that they still mattered. But none of them had seen the real Sith. None had stood in the halls of Korriban. None had survived the fire of betrayal. They were children playing at prophecy, and Red had been their final toy. He listened to one final recording. The overseer's voice again speaking as if to a future version of himself. "If he kills me," the man said softly, "it means he was worthy. It means the bloodline continues, even without the blood." Red shut the terminal off. There was no bloodline, no order, no line to continue. The Sith weren't extinct because they were weak. They were extinct because they refused to change. Power, legacy, rule, none of it mattered. Not when every generation devoured the one before it. Red wasn't proud of the kill. He wasn't ashamed either. He was clean, freed from the last voice, trying to write his story for him. He didn't take the overseer's cloak, didn't claim his relics, didn't mark the body. He left it where it fell. Let the ship drift. Let the air grow thin. There was no audience, no applause, no reward, only silence. And in that silence, the Force felt different. Not louder, not darker, but clearer. Like it had been waiting for him to stop listening to others. Like it had been trying to speak in his voice all along. He had been trained to fear the Jedi, but he didn't, because they had never come. He had been trained to serve the Sith, but they were gone, or hiding, or too afraid to name themselves. All that remained was him. One man, one weapon, with no orders, no cause, no name. He could have disappeared again, faded into the outer rim. Let the fire burn out. But something deeper had been lit. Not ambition, not revenge, conviction that the only way forward was to destroy everything that had come before. Not with armies, not with temples, but with a single, quiet truth. The Sith were dead, and what came next would not wear their face. Red didn't speak the words. He didn't kneel, didn't declare, didn't take a title in front of burning banners or dying crowds. He just stood there, in a drifting graveyard of forgotten promises, and accepted what had always been waiting. He was Sith now, not because someone gave him the name, but because no one else could carry it. Not the pretenders hiding in the dark, not the relic hunters searching ruins for lost secrets, not the galaxy which had buried the Sith like a myth. Only him. And yet, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral, because what he inherited wasn't a throne. It was ash. Every empire the Sith had built had burned. Every code they preached had broken. Every apprentice had betrayed. Every master had fallen. And now he stood alone in the wreckage of it all, the last echo of a philosophy that had killed itself over and over again. He didn't want to rebuild it. He didn't want to lead. He didn't want to teach. He just wanted the lies to stop. The ones the Jedi told that the dark side was madness. The ones the Sith told that power was everything. The ones everyone else told that the past was dead. It wasn't dead. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to stop pretending, to stop wearing masks, to stop repeating the cycle with new names and old mistakes. Red didn't leave the Overseer's ship for 3 more days. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because he needed to feel it, the full weight of what he'd done. Not just the killing, the ending. He spent those days in silence. No training, no meditation, just stillness. He watched the stars from the broken viewport, watched trade vessels jump to hyperspace without noticing the forgotten ship in their path, watched a galaxy continue turning, unaware that something ancient had stirred again. He didn't light his saber, didn't sharpen his armor. He just listened. And the Force, the same presence that had followed him since childhood, no longer pulled at him like a leash. It moved with him, quiet, subtle, no longer trying to direct, only to witness. On the final day, he found an old Sith pendant buried in the Overseer's storage, cracked, rusted, still etched with the mark of the one Sith. He held it in his hand and crushed it, not as rebellion, not as rage, but as clarity. The Sith weren't sacred, they were broken, and if he was going to carry the name, he would carry it without illusion. He left the ship without ceremony, let it drift into the gravity well of the dead star. Didn't watch it fall, didn't mourn, because what he had destroyed wasn't a person, it was a lineage, and what he had claimed wasn't power, it was responsibility. He didn't wear robes, didn't build a throne, didn't speak the ancient codes. But from that moment forward, he was Sith, not as the galaxy remembered them, not as the Jedi warned against, not even as the dark side demanded. He was something else, a flame that refused to burn for anyone else. A survivor standing in the ashes of 1,000 fallen lords. A new darkness, not loud, not wild, but quiet, focused, and for the first time, he knew exactly who he was. Red didn't leave the dead star behind as a conqueror. He left as something the galaxy had no name for. Not an apprentice, not a master, not a remnant of a fallen empire. Something new, something the old Sith would have feared. For the first time, he moved without shadows pulling at him, without voices whispering purpose. without chains disguised as tradition. He drifted through the black between systems, the same way he had as a child, but the feeling was different now. Back then, he had wandered because he had nowhere to go. Now, he wandered because he chose to. The galaxy still believed the Sith were gone, that their graves were sealed, that the last flame had died with Crate. But Red felt that belief like a pressure in the Force, a blind spot, a weakness, an empty space no one guarded. He stepped into it quietly, like slipping between breaths. Passing through trade stations, he felt the fear people carried beneath their smiles. He listened to smugglers whisper about rising warlords. He heard Jedi Knights speak softly about disturbances they couldn't trace. He saw government officers bury reports of strange sightings on Outer Rim worlds. They didn't know him, didn't see him, didn't realize the man sitting in the corner booth with a hood over his eyes was the answer to all their questions. He didn't hide because he feared discovery. He hid because none of them were ready to understand him. He wasn't like the Sith of old who sought control, domination, immortality. He didn't crave thrones of red iron or fleets burning across the stars. He didn't dream of empires rising beneath his hand. His ambition was colder, narrower, sharper. He didn't want to rule the galaxy. He wanted to reshape the idea of what a Sith could be, even if no one ever knew it was him who did it. For generations, Sith philosophy had been wrapped in layers of ritual and pride. Legacy, code, lineage. But all of it had led to the same ending: death at the hands of their own. Red refused that path. He refused to kneel to the dead, refused to wear their symbols, refused to repeat their failures. He carried the dark side not as a banner, but as a blade, quiet, precise, personal. A weapon used only when necessary. There were no temples for him, no apprentices waiting to inherit his burden, no holocrons filled with his voice. He lived in motion, traveling from world to world, shaping the Force within himself, unlearning the lies that had trained him. Some nights he meditated in the ruins of imperial stations, feeling the echo of soldiers marching long ago. Other nights he sat beside campfires on uncharted moons, the sky filled with stars that had never known Sith or Jedi. And every night the same truth followed him. He was alone, but he was not lost. Aloneness wasn't weakness. It wasn't exile. It was clarity. The Jedi feared attachment. The Sith feared betrayal. Red feared neither. His power belonged to him, and him alone. One evening, in the silence of a derelict mining station, he activated his lightsaber again. The red blade rose like a quiet heartbeat in the dark. He stared at it not with pride, but with understanding. This wasn't a weapon of tradition. It wasn't a mark of lineage. It wasn't proof of anything. It was a reminder. He wasn't a Sith because someone declared it. He wasn't a Sith because he won a duel. He wasn't a Sith because he carried the dark side. He was Sith because he survived when every part of the past tried to consume him. He was Sith because he chose to be. And in that choice, in that calm, absolute certainty, something ancient shifted in the Force. A new chapter had begun, not for the galaxy, but for the darkness that lived between its stars. Darth Wredd had taken his first true step, and he would walk the path ahead, alone. The one Sith were supposed to be gone. Darth Crate had fallen. His empire had crumbled, and the galaxy had moved on. But in the cold vacuum between systems, Red found something that shouldn't have survived. A transmission, weak, fragmented, hidden beneath civilian chatter and forgotten sensor buoys. It wasn't addressed to him. It wasn't even meant for discovery, but the Force pulled him to it. A single crest flickered through static, red and black. The mark of Crate, the mark of the one Sith. He didn't feel fear. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. He traced the signal across 3 sectors, watching it hop through dead relays and phantom nodes. Whoever had sent it was careful, disciplined, not loud, not recruiting, but communicating, like a body trying to feel if any of its limbs were still alive. Red didn't follow it for curiosity. He followed it because it insulted him. The one Sith had already betrayed everything they claimed to stand for. They wore the name without the sacrifice. They embraced unity while practicing control. They spoke of evolution, while clinging to Crate's rot. They didn't deserve to rise again. He found the source on a drifting communications barge parked inside the gravity wake of a collapsed star. The vessel was old, modified. No weapons, no defenses. Just encrypted data, hidden inside the shell of a mining transport. Inside, he found 3 people. Not warriors, not Sith lords, messengers. They didn't recognize him when he entered. Just another traveler, another shadow. Until he spoke, "Who do you serve?" They hesitated. The one in charge, an older woman with a facial implant, gave the answer he expected. "Darth Crate. The will of the one Sith lives on." He nodded once. No expression. No pause. Then he ignited his saber. It was over in seconds. No ceremony. No argument. The data core burned with the rest. He didn't leave a symbol. Didn't broadcast a warning. Didn't explain. Because what he was doing wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even vengeance. It was removal. Erasure. The one Sith had poisoned the name he carried. Not just with defeat but with arrogance. They believed they could rise again because the galaxy forgot what they'd become. Red hadn't forgotten. He remembered the wreckage they left behind. The forced conversions, the false unity, the obsession with legacy wrapped in lies. They had buried Bane's rule of 2 beneath Crate's rule of 1, not as evolution but as theft. And Red would not let them return, not while he still breathed. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was heard all the same. Because others were listening, other remnants, other survivors, other watchers in the dark who still clung to Crate's name like a flag. They didn't know who he was, only that someone had found one of their signals and ended it. A whisper traveled across the outer rim, short, cold, final. "He's still out there." The one Sith didn't know what they had woken. They didn't know what they were facing. Because Red wasn't building an army. He wasn't calling for war. He wasn't looking to rule. He was removing rot, quietly, precisely, without mercy, without delay. And for the first time, he had chosen his enemy. Not the Jedi, not the Republic, not the remnants of the old Sith. His enemy was the order that had buried the truth beneath its lies, and he would not stop until every trace of it was gone. Red didn't celebrate the destruction of the barge. He didn't consider it a victory. He considered it a beginning, the first step into a darkness he chose instead of inherited. For the first time in his life, the target was clear. Not a phantom, not a story told by liars, but a real enemy. The one Sith had survived. Not as an empire, not as an army, but as embers scattered across forgotten systems, fragments trying to reignite a fire that deserved to die. Red would be the hand that smothered it. He followed the trail of transmissions to a half-abandoned moon near the Polemian trade route. The surface was dead, but the mines beneath still breathed with stolen energy. Someone had been building something here slowly, quietly, for years. When Red entered the mining tunnels, he felt it instantly. Fear. Not his. Theirs. It clung to the Duracrete, echoed through the empty corridors. A fear shaped by internal betrayal, not outside threat. The one Sith were not united. They were breaking from the inside. He moved through the tunnels without haste, letting the Force lead him. Down ramps, past rusted machinery, into a chamber lit by red emergency lights. 6 of them waited. Not acolytes, not apprentices, assassins. Their armor bore faint red markings, the old insignia of Krait's empire, scraped away until only the outline remained. They looked at Red like a problem, not a threat, a figure to be removed. One stepped forward. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. Red didn't answer. "Identify yourself," the man ordered. Red lifted his head, just enough, just once. "No." The assassin drew his blade. Red drew nothing. When the man lunged, Red moved like the Force had already shown him the path. A tilt of the head, a step backward, a shift of the wrist. The assassin hit the wall before he understood what had happened. Red took his saber then, not to intimidate, not to posture, but to end this cleanly. The red blade hummed to life, and the room changed. The assassins attacked together, trained, coordinated, disciplined. It didn't matter. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster. He was certain. Every strike they made was already dead when it reached him. Every angle they chose collapsed into his rhythm. Every breath they took gave him the next step. He moved not like a Sith Lord commanding power, but like a survivor who had lived his whole life preparing for this exact moment. Moments later, the chamber was silent. Only the glow of his blade remained. When he deactivated it, the darkness returned with a weight that didn't scare him. It welcomed him. At the back of the chamber sat their commander wrapped in crimson cloth, face painted in the old Sith style. He hadn't fought. He hadn't moved. He had watched. "You seek to replace us," the commander said quietly. "No. Then what are you?" Red stepped forward. Correction. He moved his blade once. The commander fell without resistance, as if he had known this moment was coming long before Red arrived. Red searched their data terminal afterward. No grand plan. No armies assembling. Just fragments. Messages. Coordinates for other cells scattered across the galaxy. Enough to rebuild something hateful. Enough to resurrect a lie. He deleted all of it. Not to hide his work, but to deny them their future. When he walked out of the mines, the ground shook behind him. The charges he planted erased the base completely, burying every scrap of Krait's legacy beneath stone. The first blade had fallen. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but with purpose. And the galaxy did not notice, because it wasn't supposed to once. This war wasn't for the galaxy. It was for the truth. And Red carried that truth. Alone. Red never left a mark, no crest, no symbol, no name, but the galaxy began to whisper. It started in the outer rim. Fleeting reports from abandoned facilities. Data wiped. Personnel missing. No signs of struggle, just silence where power had once tried to grow. Then came the disappearances. Couriers, messengers, spies still loyal to Krait's vision. One by one, they stopped responding. And behind it all, no image. No holo-recordings, just a presence moving between systems like smoke that never left a trail. The one Sith panicked. But they never said it aloud. They blamed each other, first called it disloyalty, desertion, treason. Their network had already been fragile, held together by secrecy and fear. Now it was unraveling from the inside, pulled apart by something no one had seen clearly. A ghost, a rumor, a myth, but Wredd was real. He moved without rhythm, without pattern, never striking twice in the same region. One day, he sabotaged a weapons cache hidden beneath a starport on Felucia. The next, he intercepted a coded transmission near the deep core, exposing a false Jedi spy who was feeding the Order intelligence. He didn't kill everyone, only those who remembered what the one Sith had done. He let others live not out of mercy, but design. So they would talk, so they would wonder, so they would fear, and they did. Within cycles, his name began to circulate, quietly, uncertainly. Not Wredd, not yet, just a shape, a theory, a phrase whispered in darkened halls. The red blade with no master. Some believed he was an inquisitor gone rogue. Others swore he was a clone of Crate, purging the weak to begin again. One cell in the expansion region even began hunting its own, convinced the killer was among them. They were right. Wredd was already there, watching, waiting. He didn't strike that time. He let them tear each other apart. Because fear did the work faster than his blade ever could. He understood something the one Sith never had. Control wasn't the most powerful form of domination. Isolation was. If they feared each other, they would never trust again. And if they couldn't trust, they couldn't unify. He didn't need to destroy the entire Order. He just needed to make sure it could never become an Order again. And so the myth grew. They started assigning him attacks he hadn't made, sabotage he hadn't planned, deaths he hadn't caused. And he let them. Because the moment his enemies began to see him everywhere, they stopped seeing clearly. They built defenses where he would never go, pulled assets from strongholds to protect shadows. They collapsed from paranoia faster than they ever would from pressure. He was still alone, still wandering, still silent. But now the silence was a weapon, and every corner of the Order began to feel its edge. One message, intercepted weeks later from a splinter cell near Ord Mantell, said it best. He doesn't speak, he doesn't lead, he doesn't rule. But he is Sith, and he's coming. Wredd read that message once, then destroyed it. He didn't need them to fear him. He needed them to fear what he represented. A darkness that refused to obey. A Sith that could not be bought. A name without doctrine, without master, without mask. The one Sith had always relied on fire, shark, force, but Wredd had learned something deeper. Smoke spreads faster, and it suffocates before it's seen. They had called themselves the one Sith. Unified, unbreakable, a single mind, a single will. An order that would not fracture like the old ones. But Wredd didn't need to break them. He just made them remember they were already broken. They didn't fall with one battle. There was no final duel. No throne room confrontation. No galaxy-wide purge. Their collapse happened in whispers. In choices made from fear. In secrets kept from each other. One cell vanished without explanation near the Tyon cluster. Another retreated to the unknown regions and cut all contact. Dozens of sleeper agents turned off their comms and never turned them back on. Their web of control frayed strand by strand, not because of a superior enemy, but because they could no longer tell truth from threat. Wredd watched it all from afar. He didn't claim credit. He didn't need to. He simply waited. waited as they turned on each other, as suspicion ate strategy, as their legacy collapsed under its own weight. One commander, once a high-ranking tactician under Krait's reign, gathered a force to hunt Wredd directly. 15 operatives, 2 stealth ships, advanced tracking. They found nothing. No signal, no heat signature, no trail. But when the commander returned to his forward base, he found every file on the mission had been deleted. His operatives were gone, his authority stripped, not by Wredd, by the order itself. He had become a liability, a threat not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd failed to prevent. He vanished shortly after. Some say he ran, others say Wredd found him first. The truth didn't matter, because by then, the one Sith had already lost something more dangerous than numbers. They had lost belief, belief that they were the future, belief that their unity was unbreakable, belief that the dark side chose them. Wredd had never asked the Force for permission, never spoken of destiny, never claimed legacy, but he moved with the kind of clarity they had forgotten. He didn't rule, he didn't recruit, he didn't explain, and that was what made him real. A Sith without corruption, without craving, without need for a master's voice. They couldn't understand it, so they called it heresy. They called him a traitor to tradition, a threat to the rule, a weapon gone rogue. But the rule was already dead. They just hadn't buried it yet. By the time they realized it, it was too late. Redd's silence had done what no fleet ever could. He made them feel hunted, not by a movement, not by a rebellion, by a man, one man, and when fear has a face, an order cannot hold. The last secure transmission recorded from a one Sith stronghold on Cernpidal Prime ended mid-sentence. He isn't coming for our power. He's coming because we pretend to have it. No one answered the distress call, because by then, there was nothing left to save. Wredd never stepped forward to declare victory, never claimed he had ended the one Sith, because he hadn't. He had simply revealed what they truly were. Pretenders, fragments, a reflection of a failure too proud to die. The galaxy would never know how close they had come to rising again, and they would never understand how one man, walking alone, without followers or fame, ended an empire before it could begin. He did not do it with fire. He did it with silence. And in that silence, Darth Wredd became something the Sith had not seen in generations. A threat they could not control. He didn't remember when the armor stopped being protection and started being prison. The first pieces had been scavenged, bent durasteel plates pulled from battlefields no one bothered to name. He never cared what the symbols meant. He scraped them off, replaced the colors, made them disappear. It was never about pride or intimidation. It was about silence. The armor kept people away, and over time, it kept him inside. To the galaxy, Darth Wredd was a shadow, a red blade without a master, a name that never spoke, a myth wrapped in metal. But inside that myth was breath, bone, tired muscles, and silence that no longer comforted him. He slept less now, not from fear, but from noise, not outside, inside. The Force used to be quiet with him, a current he could feel beneath his skin, soft and steady. But now, it moved like a storm behind his eyes. He started hearing echoes, not voices, just moments, footsteps on stone halls that didn't exist, screams muffled by airless space, laughter distant, wrong, familiar. Sometimes, in the quiet between hyperlanes, he would remove the helmet. Not to breathe, but to feel something. The cold against his skin. The weight of the metal in his hands. The way his reflection looked in cracked glass. Not like a Sith. Not like a warrior. Just a man, trying not to disappear. There were scars on his face he didn't remember getting. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. And in those moments, helmet off, silence pressing down, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. He never spoke his own name. Not because he feared it, but because it didn't feel real anymore. Red had become the name others gave him. The title that filled datapads, warnings, whispered reports. He wore it like the armor, not because it fit, but because it was the only thing left. No one knew who he had been before, not even him. And when he looked into the darkness of space, watching stars flicker through his ship's viewport, he wondered what it meant to be Sith when no one was watching, when there were no apprentices, no empires, no doctrine, just you, and the mask you chose to wear. He had told himself it was choice, that he had rejected the old ways, that he was free, but the armor was heavy, not from metal, from meaning. It held every lie that had been told to him, every failure he carried, every death he didn't speak of. And somewhere beneath it all was a boy who had once been told he would become something greater. He never had. He had only become what was left. When his ship passed through a debris field near a collapsed Sith temple, he paused, not to search, not to scavenge, just to look. The temple was gone, stones scattered across orbit, ash drifting through cold. He imagined standing in its center, not as Darth Wredd, but as the child he had once been, wide-eyed, curious, hopeful. But the image faded. Like everything else, he placed the helmet back on. The hiss of sealed air returned, and once again there was silence. Not peace, not clarity, just silence. The kind that didn't listen, the kind that didn't let go. And in that silence, Darth Wredd drifted farther from the man he might have been, and closer to the shadow the galaxy had already decided he was. He didn't remember sleeping. Not really. Rest came in fragments, a few minutes at a time. Cold, restless, hollow. But the dreams came anyway. At first, they were formless. Colors without shape. Sound without language. Whispers that vanished the moment he opened his eyes. Then the shapes returned. He saw the Overseer again, not as he died, but as he was during the early lessons. His hands behind his back, his voice low, speaking words Red couldn't hear anymore. Just the movement of his mouth, repeating the same phrase in silence. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. He saw the girl from his childhood, Lysa, sitting across from him in the ruins of a fortress that never existed. She looked older now, her face calm, her eyes full of something he'd forgotten how to carry. Trust. She reached for him. Not with fear, not with command, just presence. And when he tried to take her hand, her body faded into mist. He didn't wake in fear. He woke in stillness, covered in sweat, breath unsteady, hands clenched without knowing why. He thought it was memory at first. The Force, pulling pieces of his past into focus. But it wasn't memory. Not exactly. Because some of the faces he saw in those dreams, he didn't recognize. An old man wearing Jedi robes, kneeling before a tree of fire. A child running through a war zone, clutching a red crystal like it was a lifeline. A woman speaking in the ancient Sith tongue, though her lips never moved. None of them were his, and yet they felt like parts of him. like the Force had opened a door too wide, and now others were walking through. Red stopped meditating. The dreams only came when he lowered his guard, when his mind tried to reach for meaning. So he stopped reaching. Let the tension build behind his eyes. Let his thoughts blur beneath weight. But the visions didn't stop. Even awake, he started seeing moments that didn't belong to the present. He'd walk into a spaceport and see flickers of a battle that happened years ago. Men shouting in uniforms long since faded. He'd sit in a cantina and hear two voices behind him, only to turn and find no one there. He wasn't afraid. He'd lived too long to fear things without form. But he was tired of carrying echoes, tired of wondering which part of his mind still belonged to him, tired of not knowing what the Force wanted, because it did want something. He could feel it. It moved around him like a current, no longer subtle, no longer passive. It pressed against his thoughts. It pulled at his memories. It whispered through people he didn't know and places he hadn't been. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in paths, moments, like it was trying to show him something, but never told him why. And each time he resisted, the pressure grew, until he began to wonder if the Force was trying to remind him, not of what he'd lost, but of what he was becoming. He was no longer just Red, no longer just Sith. He was a convergence, a point where past and present blurred. And if he kept walking this path, if he kept surviving, he might not survive himself. He had outlived them all. The loyalists who trained him, the pretenders who called themselves Sith, the assassins who hunted him, the Jedi who once suspected he existed. And now, there was no one left. No one who knew his face. No one who knew his name. No one who understood what he carried. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. It felt like standing at the top of a mountain no one else had tried to climb, and realizing the only thing up there was silence. The longer he survived, the heavier it became. Not physically, not through wounds or strain, but inside, a pressure behind the ribs, a quiet ache he couldn't name. He moved from world to world, now without purpose, not hunting, not hiding, just moving. He thought about speaking sometimes, to travelers, to traders, to people who passed him by without seeing him, just to hear his own voice again. But the words never came. Because what would he say? He wasn't seeking guidance. He wasn't seeking redemption. He wasn't seeking war. He was seeking something he couldn't define. And that was the problem. He had walked so far down this path, survived so many battles, endured so much silence, that he couldn't tell if he was still going forward, or just trying to remember how to stop. The galaxy kept spinning. New orders rose. New names filled the holonets. Conflicts flared and faded, and Red stayed in the cracks, watching, waiting, enduring. He never sought connection, but that didn't mean he didn't want it. He just didn't believe he could have it. Because to reach for someone, to trust, to care, was to hand them a weapon. And he had been shaped by people who only knew how to use weapons. One night, on a half-frozen moon near the edge of the expansion region, he came across a small refugee camp. No soldiers, no guards, just families displaced by a war that had nothing to do with him. He didn't go in. He watched from the ridge. Hours passed. Fires burned low. Children laughed in the dark. It felt wrong, not because they were happy, but because they reminded him of what he had never had. He imagined walking down, setting aside the armor, sitting near the fire, saying nothing, but being there. Then he saw a child look in his direction. Eyes wide, breath caught. No words, just fear. She couldn't see his face, but she knew what he was. Even hidden in shadow, the Force marked him. Not with evil, but with weight. And to someone untouched by it, that weight felt like danger. He turned away before she could call for help. The next day, he was gone. He didn't hate them for their fear. He understood it. But part of him, a small part, wanted someone to see him and not look away. Not because he needed redemption, but because he was still human. Somewhere beneath the scars, somewhere beneath the mask. He had built a life where survival was the only goal. But survival without witness wasn't life. It was a slow fading, and Red was starting to feel it. Not as pain, not as doubt, but as emptiness. The kind that grows in quiet places. The kind that makes the strongest warriors wonder if they ever truly existed. Outside of war, he didn't see the ambush coming. Not because he was weak, not because he was distracted, but because, for a moment, he stopped believing anyone still wanted to kill him. It happened on a transport moon orbiting a fuel-rich gas giant in the mid-rim. Neutral territory, old trade routes, no known threats. He was walking toward a freight dock, just another figure in a black cloak among hundreds, when the Force surged behind his eyes. Too late. The first shot hit his shoulder. The armor cracked. The pain was immediate, white, sharp, alive. He spun. Reflex, instinct, survival. The second shot missed. The third didn't. It hit near his side, between the plates. He fell backward, hard. People scattered. No one screamed. No one helped. Whoever they were, they didn't speak, didn't shout threats, didn't call his name. Just four of them, moving like professionals, moving like they knew exactly who he was and what he could survive. He drew the saber but couldn't lift it. His arm was numb, the pain behind his ribs deeper now, his vision beginning to narrow. He reached for the Force. It didn't roar. It didn't crash. It whispered. He let go. Let it move through him like it always had. Not as command, but as presence. And something inside him shifted. The saber activated. He didn't remember moving, only the light, then heat, then blood, then silence. He didn't remember how he survived. Only that, when it ended, he was alone again, bleeding, on the floor of an empty dock. No authorities came. No civilians returned. The ship he was meant to board was gone. And for the first time in years, Red thought he might die. Not in battle, not in legacy, just alone, in the dark, with no name spoken, and no one to remember. He lay there for hours, too weak to move, too tired to care. He didn't fear death, but he feared vanishing. He feared becoming another myth, a whisper that drifted too far to matter. He'd built his life around silence, but in that moment, he wished someone would speak his name, even once. When he finally stood barely, he didn't roar back, didn't promise revenge, didn't look for who sent them, because it didn't matter. It wasn't about enemies. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about what broke inside him when he realized he had nothing left to prove. He returned to his ship without ceremony, patched the wounds, sat in the dark. The armor sat beside him, blood-stained, cracked, bent. He didn't reach for it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a wall he used to lean on, something that held him once, but would never hold him the same way again. The mask was part of it. The part that covered his face. The part that made him disappear. He picked it up, held it in both hands, and then he pressed his thumb into the crack that ran beneath the right lens. He didn't fix it. He left it. Because something inside him knew. He wasn't whole anymore. And maybe he never had been. The mask still fit. But now, it let the air in. Let the weight leak out. Let the man beneath breathe again. Not fully, not freely, but enough to remember he was still there. Still alive. Still unfinished. And in that breath, Darth Wredd didn't fall. He fractured. Quietly. Privately. And somewhere deep inside, something softer than rage finally stirred. He never wanted to be known. Not as a leader. Not as a teacher. Not even as Sith. Wredd had built his life in silence. Through shadows. Through survival. Through solitude. But silence doesn't stay silent forever. Not when fear speaks louder. Somewhere in the outer rim, a small sect of Force sensitives began calling themselves Wredd's Chosen. They claimed to carry his doctrine, claimed to have received visions, claimed to be his instruments. They wore red armor, used his name like a weapon, spoke of him as a prophet who had returned to restore the Sith through fire, not patience. He heard the rumors on Dalang. A merchant whispering about a world raided by red soldiers, dozens dead, Jedi ambushed, settlements burned. He didn't believe it at first. But when he reached the surface of that world, the mark carved into the gates of a collapsed temple was his. Not by design, by theft, a symbol he had never used, now carried by others. He stood in the ash of that place. No survivors, no sound, just his name, echoing in destruction he didn't cause. And for the first time in years, he felt something worse than betrayal. He felt distortion. His silence, once a weapon, had been misread as command. His mask, once a shield, had become a banner. They hadn't just stolen his name, they had stolen his meaning. The galaxy had always misunderstood the Sith. But now, it misunderstood him. He left no messages, spoke to no authorities. He just followed the trail. One base led to another, one group of fanatics to a second, then a third, each claiming to be loyal to a ghost they had never met. They had turned him into doctrine. And doctrine spreads faster than truth. Soon, across entire sectors, people whispered of Wredd's return. A red figure who punished the Jedi, who struck from nowhere, who carried no army but whose name summoned violence. And with every planet that fell, the real Wredd became harder to find. He heard his name used in black market negotiations, saw it appear in manifestos posted on outlaw data feeds. He even found bounty hunters offering contracts under the guise of Wredd's order. He tried to stay ahead of it, tried to dismantle the false network before it grew too strong. But lies grow fast in a galaxy that wants to believe them. And what started as rumor became war. Ships were taken, cities occupied. Small sects of rogue Force wielders emerged from hiding, claiming to serve the new Sith cause. All in his name. The Jedi began investigating. The Outer Rim defense grids were reinforced. And the legend of Darth Wredd, the one who had never declared war, became the reason war returned. And Wredd watched. Not with rage, not with guilt, with clarity. He had spent his life shaping himself, refining, surviving, becoming. Now others had stolen the shape, filed down the truth, recast him into something he never was. A warlord, a zealot, a false god of the Sith. He had become a story, and stories are hard to kill. He didn't know who started it. Didn't care. Because it didn't matter who lit the fire. He would be the one to put it out. Even if it meant burning the shadow that now wore his face. There are deaths you choose, and there are deaths you inherit. Wredd had killed before. Cleanly. Deliberately. Without pleasure. Without pride. But now, he was chasing bodies that weren't his. Entire outposts were turning up scorched. Not just military posts, civilian settlements. Sith symbols carved into walls. Bodies mutilated. Jedi patrols lured into ambushes and cut down before they could call for help. And everywhere he went, the name Wredd was whispered like a curse. Not spoken in fear. Spoken in reverence. He arrived at a moon near Etravis, where 20 families had been executed in a warehouse. The words Shadow Reign had been painted in crimson above the doors. Witnesses said a figure in red armor had led the massacre. Tall, silent, no face. They said he called himself the real Darth Wredd. Wredd didn't speak when he found the man. Didn't question. Didn't hesitate. He simply ignited the blade. The duel lasted less than a minute. The imposter never had control of the Force. Just armor. Just theatrics. Just a weapon he didn't know how to wield. Wredd ended him. Swift, precise. But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like cleaning rot. He dragged the body into the center of the warehouse. Sat beside it for hours. Not in mourning. In calculation. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something worse. More were coming. Not strong. Not trained. But devoted. Believers in a version of him that had never existed. Disciples of an idea he'd never spoken aloud. They weren't trying to restore the Sith. They were trying to become the fear he represented. And in doing so, they left him only one option. He began tracking them, system by system, cutting off arms of a network that didn't know who created it. Most of them weren't Force-sensitive, just angry, desperate, drawn to the myth, but a few were something else. On Celeb Prime, he found a masked woman who called herself Red Echo. She wielded a red saber and claimed to be his student. Claimed he had visited her in dreams. Claimed she was fulfilling his destiny. She was fast, sharp, trained but not by him. Wredd disarmed her, then asked a question he hadn't asked in years. Why me? Her answer was quiet. You survived. Then she tried to kill him again. He didn't let her. He buried her saber in the dunes outside her outpost. Didn't take it. Didn't destroy it. Just buried it. Because that blade didn't belong to him. None of it did. He wasn't leading a movement. He was dismantling a lie. And the more he erased, the more it spread. Each time he killed a follower, 2 more appeared somewhere else. Each time he disproved the myth, someone else rewrote it. He wasn't chasing enemies anymore. He was chasing echoes, reflections of a shadow that no longer answered to him. He didn't hate them, not most of them, but he couldn't allow them to keep wearing his name. Because for every innocent killed in his shadow, the truth died a little more. And if he didn't stop it, then silence would no longer be his weapon. It would be his guilt. He never looked in the mirror anymore. Not because of shame, because he no longer knew who was looking back. The mask had 100 imitators now. Every false disciple he tracked wore some version of it. Some copied the curve of the visor. Others painted their armor red to match the rumors. A few even burned their skin, believing pain would bring them closer to his power. Wredd watched the recordings, dozens of them, fake sermons, Crude training rituals, chants spoken in broken Sith dialects. Each one claimed allegiance to a Red doctrine. Each one used his name as a promise. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know he had never offered anything. No path, no redemption, no future. He had only survived. That was it. But survival, to them, looked like strength. And strength gave them permission to create violence in his shape. He began eliminating them faster. No more warnings. No more questions. On the smog-choked world of Barab III, he dismantled a group called the Red Flame. 32 followers, 4 Force sensitives, 1 self-declared Hand of Red. They never saw him coming. He shut down their power grid, moved through their base like smoke, struck without light, left only the leader alive, just long enough for him to speak. "We're trying to help you," the man said. His voice was shaking. His armor cracked. He bled from the mouth. Red stared at him. "I never asked for help." Then he ended him. There were no speeches, no executions made public, no threats broadcast to the stars. He erased them like cleaning a wound. Because that's what they were now. Infection. He traveled to 3 more systems that month, each one with its own version of his myth. Some were small, a dozen beings in a ruined hangar, praying to an image of his helmet. Others were larger, fully armed vessels marked with Sith crests they didn't understand. Each time, the violence came quicker, cleaner. He had stopped wondering how they found him. He had started asking why they needed him. Why did the galaxy want another Red? Why did they believe a man who killed alone in silence could lead them? The answer came slowly. Because it was easier to follow a shadow than to live without one. They didn't believe in the old Sith. Not anymore. Not in Crate, not in Bane, not even in the Jedi's version of evil. They believed in fear that looked like control. And he had become their mirror. Not the man, the myth. Every time he fought one of them, he saw himself reflected in their movements. The way they stood, the way they didn't speak, the way they ignited their sabers without hesitation. He had trained no one. But they had learned from him anyway. Not from lessons, from legend. And now, he was trapped in it. Every time he struck down another imposter, he made the myth stronger. Because the more the story spread, the more people believed he was everywhere. Even when he wasn't. Even when he didn't want to be. He had once fought for his own name. Now, he was fighting against the version of it that wouldn't die. It wasn't just war. It was war, in the mirror. A battle with a version of himself he never meant to create, and could no longer outrun. There was no throne to reclaim, no army to destroy, no Sith temple to burn. The real war was for a name, and Red had already lost control of it. The galaxy believed what it needed to believe. A red figure, a blade in the dark, a new Sith Lord rising from the shadows to lead them. But he wasn't leading. He was chasing ghosts in his own reflection, clearing blood from a name he never spoke aloud, erasing echoes that refused to fade. He arrived on a moon called Telbos, where 100 acolytes had gathered beneath his stolen crest. They weren't hiding. They were celebrating. They had taken a city, drove the Jedi out, executed 2 senators on live broadcast. They stood in a circle, chanting his name like a hymn. Red walked through their defenses without resistance. They thought he was a blessing. They thought their master had returned. They dropped to their knees, and he cut them down, not because they were wrong, because they were right in the worst way. He didn't speak until the last one fell. Only then did he whisper not to them, to the Force, "I never asked for this." He let the city go, didn't take power, didn't make a speech. He left them in ruins and kept walking, because he knew now he couldn't kill the myth. Not entirely, but he could make it answer to him. He didn't start a war, but he could end one world at a time. He moved faster after that. No more tracking, just striking. He found the cell calling itself the Flame of Red and ended it in a day. He turned a black market gathering on Malastare into a crater when they offered slaves in his name. And when a group of mercenaries tried to negotiate with him, offering loyalty in exchange for keeping the myth alive, he told them one word: no. Then made sure no one else heard from them again. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a god. He was a correction. A wound closing over an infection. They kept coming, but fewer now. The galaxy was starting to realize. The man behind the mask was not who they thought. He didn't seek rule. He didn't seek followers. He sought silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of truth. A space where the name Red belonged to no one but him. He returned once to the moon where he'd been ambushed, where the armor cracked and the silence nearly became his grave. He stood in the place where the blood had dried, looked at the wall where someone had carved a tribute. It read, "He lives because we believe." He destroyed it, because belief doesn't make truth, and survival doesn't make you right. He lived because he endured, and now he endured to reclaim himself. The battle for a name isn't fought in fire. It's fought in the spaces between, in the choices that don't echo, in the wounds that don't scar. He never told the galaxy who he was. He let them decide, and they were wrong. Now he would show them, not through speeches, not through conquest, through action, through the silence between strikes, through the final breath of every false disciple who dared to speak his name, without understanding what it cost. It started as a feeling, not danger, not warning, something smaller, a thread tugging at the edge of Red's awareness, like breath against the back of his mind. He didn't know the name, didn't know the source, but he felt it. Someone was watching him, not through sight, through the Force, and unlike others who had come before, hunters, mercenaries, Sith fanatics, this presence didn't burn with anger. It listened. Red didn't change his movements. He had learned not to react to shadows. He simply noted the silence that now moved in parallel with his own. Zhao Assam had survived Osses. Barely. A Jedi Knight forged in the ashes of old temples, raised among stories of heroes and fallen orders, trained by voices who feared repeating the past. But Zhao wasn't afraid of the past. He was afraid of pretending it was gone. He had studied the aftermath of the one Sith's collapse. He had read reports of the red-bladed figure moving from ruin to ruin. Everywhere he went, someone died. A warlord, a cult, a false prophet. But not civilians, not the weak. That's what caught Zhao's attention. The pattern, the restraint. Red didn't conquer. He corrected. And that didn't feel like the Sith the Council warned him about. So he followed. Not because he was ordered to. Because he needed to understand. The galaxy had taught him to fear the dark side. But this one, this presence, it felt different. Red began sensing him in the spaces between travel, while repairing his ship, while meditating on backwater moons, while walking alone through abandoned temples. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't pursuit. It was presence. Measured, constant, unspoken. He set traps. left false trails. Nothing worked, but there was never a strike, no attack, no saber drawn. Just quiet observation from someone strong enough to be closer than he should have been. Red began to wonder, what kind of Jedi hunts without striking? He began to shift his routine, visited dead systems, cut across hyperspace with erratic jumps. Still, he felt it, always near, never intrusive. And somewhere in that silence, curiosity began to grow. He'd met Jedi before. Briefly, violently. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wait. But this one, he watched. As if he didn't believe the stories. As if he was trying to see the man beneath the mask. Zhao meditated on that same question. Every time he found a place Red had passed through, he found contradiction. Weapons destroyed, not stolen. Sith cults dismantled, not recruited. And the survivors, they weren't afraid of Red. They were afraid of what had tried to become him. The Jedi archives had little on Red. No confirmed origin, no confirmed rank. Just a string of redacted operations and one phrase repeated again and again. Not Sith, not Jedi. Dangerous because we don't know why. That's what made Zhao follow. Because somewhere in the unknown was a truth the Order had never faced. Not all darkness comes to conquer. Some simply survives. And dares to do so, alone. The ruins of Ossis had grown quiet. Too quiet. The fires had been gone for years. The halls had collapsed. The libraries emptied, then left to rot. But memory still lived here, and Zhao Assam walked through it like a student again. Not for lessons, for answers. He followed Red's trail for months, crossed systems that once burned in the Clone Wars, passed through wreckage where the Empire fell and rose again. And always the same pattern. No allies, no banners, no claim of power, just silence, and the aftermath of violence carefully chosen. It didn't make sense. If Red was Sith, he should have wanted control. If he was broken, he should have left chaos behind him. But everywhere Zhao followed, there was precision. And on Ossus, there was something else. Compassion. He found a collapsed sanctuary deep beneath the archives. The survivors had tried to escape through the tunnels, but debris had sealed them in. Red had come through 3 days later. They thought he'd kill them. They'd heard the rumors, seen the mask, but he didn't attack. He lifted the rubble, quietly, wordlessly, then left. Didn't speak. Didn't take credit, just vanished again. One of the survivors, an older Mirialan woman who had once taught younglings, described the way he moved. He looked tired, she said. Not angry, just tired, like the galaxy kept asking him to be something he wasn't. Zhao stayed in that chamber for hours, felt the place where Red had stood, reached out with the Force. And for the first time, felt the absence of darkness. Not light, not serenity, just absence. The kind of emptiness that doesn't destroy. The kind that carries weight. He sat cross-legged on the cold stone, closed his eyes, and tried to understand. Who fights in silence? Who saves without staying? Who carries a name like a wound and never lets it heal? He didn't find a vision, didn't hear the Force speak. But a question began forming at the center of his thoughts. What if Red wasn't trying to escape the Jedi, or the Sith? What if he was escaping the story they both kept telling? Ossus had once been a sanctuary for knowledge. Now, it was a graveyard for both truth and myth. And Zhao realized something most Jedi wouldn't admit. The Council had never wanted to understand Red, only categorize him. Threat, Sith, unstable, anything that made him easier to justify eliminating. But Zhao didn't want justification. He wanted clarity, and Ossus gave him more than answers. It gave him perspective. He wasn't following a villain. He was following a contradiction. A man trained in lies who had refused to live by them. A Sith who didn't want power. A shadow who tried to remain unseen, and failed only because others kept chasing what they feared. Zhao stood from the stone floor, his hand brushing the dust. He knew now. He wasn't tracking a target. He was walking behind someone who never wanted to be followed. And yet, Zhao couldn't turn away, because the more he saw, the more he recognized something in Redd's silence. Not darkness, not peace, but truth. The kind you don't learn in temples. The kind you only find in the footsteps of the fallen. Their first meeting wasn't a duel. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was a moment. Quiet, unplanned, suspended in the kind of stillness the Force rarely allows. It happened on a rusted transport platform above the world of Ordalia. The air smelled of dust and engine smoke. Travelers moved like ghosts, tired, distant, unaware. Redd was standing near the edge, staring at the horizon. The kind of horizon that meant nothing. A line between sky and ground he didn't bother to understand. He felt the presence before he heard the footsteps. Steady, measured, not hiding. The Jedi didn't ignite a saber, didn't shout a warning. He simply approached. Calm, patient, hands visible. Redd didn't turn. Not at first. "You've been following me," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the wind. Zhao Assam stopped a few meters behind him. "Yes," he answered. Redd waited for the next word. "Why?" Zhao didn't lie. "Because I don't understand you." Redd finally looked over his shoulder. No armor, no robe, just a simple tunic, dust on the boots, a lightsaber hanging quietly at the Jedi's side like it had chosen to rest. Zhao looked younger than Redd expected. Younger than any Jedi who should be hunting a Sith. He didn't carry fear in his eyes. He carried curiosity. And that was new. "You don't need to understand," Redd said. Zhao stepped closer. "Maybe not, but I want to." Redd turned away again. "Your order taught you curiosity is dangerous." Zhao shook his head. "It taught me fear is more dangerous." Silence settled between them. Not tension, not threat, just silence. People walked past, unaware that a Sith and a Jedi were sharing a moment that should never have existed. Redd spoke first. "You're not here to fight." "No," Zhao answered. "You think you can save me." "No." That surprised Redd. The honesty, the simplicity. Zhao continued. "I'm here because every story about you is wrong, and I want to see the truth for myself." The words hung in the air. Redd didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. Truth. A word he had spent his whole life chasing. "What did your council tell you?" Redd asked. "That you're dangerous." "I am." "That you've killed many." "I have." "That you're trying to rebuild the Sith." Redd turned, eyes narrowing behind the cracked lens of his mask. "And did you believe them?" Zhao studied him for a long moment. "No," he said softly. "Because nothing in your path leads upward, only forward." Redd didn't know how to answer that. He didn't need to. Because Zhao stepped back. Not in retreat, but in respect. "I won't attack you," the Jedi said. "Not unless you make me." Redd tilted his head. "And if I walk away?" "I follow," Zhao said, without shame. "Until I understand." Redd almost laughed. "Almost. You're a strange Jedi." I've been told. A transport docked behind them. Engines roared. The moment teetered. Fragile. Impossible. Real. Red turned fully toward him now, face hidden, breath steady. You keep following me, he said, and you won't understand anything. Zhao didn't blink. Then I'll learn. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. And Red, who had spent his life hunted by lies, felt something he hadn't felt since the girl in the ruins. Recognition. Not acceptance. Not trust. Just recognition. The Jedi stepped aside, giving him room to leave. Red walked past him, didn't look back, and Zhao didn't draw his saber. The hunter didn't strike, the hunter didn't run. Two paths crossed, and neither man was the same after. They met again, not in battle, not in war, but in the aftermath of someone else's destruction. A temple had burned on Kinyan. A false Sith cult had risen and fallen in less than a week. Their leader claimed to serve Red, claimed to wield power given through dreams, claimed to be chosen. He wasn't. Red ended him before the first Jedi arrived. But Zhao Assam had already been on the trail. He arrived days later. The temple still smoked, the followers gone. And in the center of it all, Red sat beneath a broken pillar, breathing through the mask. They said nothing at first. Zhao stepped into the chamber slowly, not with caution, but with understanding. He knew this wasn't his victory. He knew the blade that had silenced the lie wasn't his. But he also knew something else. Red hadn't left. He could have vanished again, but he stayed, as if waiting. I didn't kill them for you, Red said without looking. I know, Zhao replied. I didn't do it to help. I know that too. Silence. Then Red asked the question that had followed him since the first time they met. Why are you still here? Zhao didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly across the cracked stone, past scorched symbols, past fallen banners, until he stood in the quiet ruin beside a man the galaxy feared but never understood. Because no one else is, Zhao said. And that was true. The Jedi didn't understand Red. The Sith no longer claimed him. The warlords and cults used him. But none of them saw him. Zhao did. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Red leaned back against the wall, exhausted, silent. If you want to fight, he said, I won't stop you. Zhao shook his head. I don't. Red's voice lowered. Then what do you want? Zhao looked down at the cracked floor, then back at him. To be the one person in the galaxy who doesn't decide who you are before asking. Red turned his head. You think I want your understanding? No, Zhao said. I think you don't know if you deserve it. The words sat heavy between them. Zhao didn't press, didn't challenge. He simply sat. Not close, not far, just present. Two warriors, neither at peace, neither at war, sharing space in a galaxy that made no room for contradictions. Red had spent his life surviving betrayals, being hunted, erasing false legacies. He'd never expected to be pursued by someone who wasn't trying to end him. And Zhao had never expected to find something in the dark that didn't ask to be saved, but didn't ask to be destroyed either. There was no alliance, no pact. They weren't friends, weren't enemies. They were mirrors, broken differently, but shaped by the same war. When the sun rose above the temple ruins, Red stood. You'll keep following me, he said. I will, Zhao answered. And one day I might kill you. Zhao nodded. I know. Red looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. But just before disappearing into the smoke and wind, he said one final thing. I hope you don't. And for Red, a man who had buried every feeling that could be turned against him, that was the closest he had come to trust. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't surrender. It was respect. The kind earned only when two paths collide, and neither one moves. It began as static, an old encrypted signal, bouncing between forgotten satellites in the outer rim. No origin, no request, just a pulse. But Red knew how to hear what others ignored. The pattern was hidden behind old Sith encryption. Not from the Empire, not from the one Sith, something else, something newer. He traced it to a region between Iktoch and Oban. A dead corridor, empty colonies, no trade, no eyes. That's what made it dangerous. Someone was building something out there. Not openly, not with armies, with whispers. And they were using Sith codes. But not his, not Krait's, not Bane's, something twisted. A hybrid of old doctrines and new desperation. It wasn't the first time Red had seen Sith pretenders try to grow in the dark. But this one was careful. The signal didn't beg for followers. It summoned them. And the voice at its center didn't speak of war. It spoke of cleansing. He moved fast. 2 systems away, Zhao Assam intercepted the same signal. His team had dismissed it. Too scattered, too small. Not worth the risk. But Zhao had learned to listen. The signal wasn't just Sith. It was Sith, spoken like prophecy. Distorted. Repetitive. Designed not to convince, but to control. He followed it alone. No council orders. No backup. He didn't tell them where he was going. Because he knew what they'd say. Don't chase the shadow. But Zhao wasn't chasing Red. Not this time. He was chasing something worse. The cult called themselves the Spiral Flame. Their leader claimed to speak with the voice of the Force itself. Claimed the Jedi and Sith were equally impure. Claimed fire would burn what the galaxy refused to bury. They weren't Sith. They weren't Jedi. They were something else. And they were spreading. Both Red and Zhao arrived on Iktoch within hours of each other. Neither expected to find the other there. But the signal had led them both to the same crater. An old mining shaft that hadn't been active in decades. The moment Red saw the other ship land on the ridge, he felt the signature in the Force. Calm, sharp, unafraid. He knew who it was. And Zhao already knew he wasn't alone. They didn't speak at first. Just stood on opposite sides of the mine's edge. 2 silhouettes lit by the red sky. 2 paths intersecting again. And below them, something neither of them could ignore. Screams, metal grinding, the chanting of a language not found in any temple. Red didn't reach for his saber. Neither did Zhao. They just looked at each other. Not with challenge, not with threat. With the same thought. You heard it too. The Force moved between them like breath. Not clashing, not pulling, just present. Red spoke first. They're not yours. Zhao nodded. They're not yours either. Another scream below. Another surge of darkness. A pause. Then Red said it quietly. We stop this. Together. It wasn't permission. It wasn't command. It was fact. Zhao didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, lightsaber in hand, but not lit. Red followed. 2 warriors walking side by side. Not because they trusted. Not because they agreed. Because the darkness beneath them didn't care what they believed. And neither of them could face it alone. The tunnels beneath Iktoch were older than the colony records, carved before the Clone Wars, abandoned after the Empire collapsed. Now, they were breathing again, not with machines, not with industry, but with voices, low, rhythmic, obsessive, chanting words the Sith had never spoken, calling for fire that didn't burn to cleanse but to consume. Red walked in front. He didn't ask Zhao to follow, but Zhao did. He could feel the tension in the Force. Not hostility, not yet, just friction. Two currents forced into the same channel. They moved without words, because neither one knew what to say. They weren't allies, but they weren't enemies anymore either. Not here, not in this place. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became. Not from dust, from energy. The kind that buzzed at the edge of thought. The kind that twisted truth into purpose. Symbols were burned into the walls, spiral patterns, hands drawn in blood, script that spoke of purification. Zhao slowed near one mark, ran his fingers across it. Red stopped. "Don't listen too long," he said. Zhao looked up. "You've seen this before." "Once," Red answered. "They call it a cleansing flame. But it only burns the weak." Zhao nodded. "They think they're the cure." "No," Red said. "They're the infection." They moved again. Down, deeper. The chanting grew louder. Not screams, not sermons, just sound without soul. When they reached the lower chamber, they saw them, 24 acolytes, kneeling around a pit of orange fire. Eyes closed, voices steady. At the center, a figure in robes that didn't belong to any order. The leader. Her voice was the loudest, but her eyes were shut. She didn't see them enter. She didn't have to. "I knew you would come," she said, still facing the fire. "I saw the red blade," she continued, "and I saw the Jedi who shadows him." Zhao tensed. Red didn't move. "You think you know us?" he asked. The woman turned. Her eyes glowed not with power, with belief. "You are the same," she whispered. "Two sides of a lie, and I am the truth." Red stepped forward. "No, you're what happens when no one tells the truth loud enough." Zhao raised his blade, didn't ignite it, but the hum in the Force shifted. The cultists rose slowly, no weapons, just hands raised, just faith. "We don't want war," the woman said. "We want to end it, all of it." "You'll end everything," Zhao replied. She smiled. "That's the point." The air cracked. Red moved first, not toward her, toward the nearest follower. A young man, barely armed, eyes vacant. He didn't kill him. He struck the ground beside him. Let the impact break the illusion. Let the sound interrupt the chant. Zhao followed, moved through the opposite side. Precision without blood. They weren't there to cleanse. They were there to stop. The cult began to break. Some screamed. Some ran. Some charged without thought. The battle was fast, focused. Red struck like a shadow collapsing. Zhao moved like light, carving through fog. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They moved like they'd done this before. But they hadn't. And when it was over, when the fire dimmed and the last believer fell, they stood at the center of the chamber. No celebration, no peace, just breath, and one question lingering between them. Not spoken, not dared. What are we becoming, if this is what we must do together? The chamber wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Beneath the fire pit, they found a hatch. Old, rusted, sealed with ancient locks twisted by the Force. Red felt them before he touched them. Wards, warnings, whispers carved into metal. This wasn't built by them, he said. Zhao nodded. The cult found it. They didn't make it. They exchanged no more words. Just glances, a shared understanding. The door opened with a hiss that tasted like age. And below it, darkness, not empty. Waiting, they dropped into it together. Red first, Zhao second. Not because they trusted, because neither was willing to let the other fall alone. The space beneath was a tomb, not for bodies, for ideas. Hollowed out long ago, the cavern was lined with fragments of old teachings. Cracked tablets, Sith war masks, books sealed in containers that pulsed faintly. But none of it was true. Red could tell. The words were wrong, the markings too clean. It was a museum built by those who only wished they understood what had come before. A false history, one used to justify violence. At the far end, they found the recordings. Dozens, hundreds, voices speaking in different languages, all saying the same thing. Everything must burn. There is no balance. Only silence after fire. Zhao looked away. Red didn't. He watched, listened. The voices were young, trained, stripped of question. "I've heard this before," he said quietly. "In pieces. From the loyalists. From Crate's children. They all spoke like this when they were too afraid to think." Zhao exhaled. "They're not Sith." "No," Red said. "They're what's left when you copy the shadow. But not the pain." That was the truth of what they'd found. Not an enemy trained to rule. Not an army built to conquer. A cult of reflections. They had studied Sith without suffering. Embraced darkness without discipline. Spoken fire without knowing what it meant to burn. Zhao sat on the floor. He looked at one of the hollows, a child no older than 10 speaking the flame's prayer. Eyes empty, voice steady. Red stayed standing, his fist clenched. "This is what happens when we let our myths outlive our truth," he said. Zhao looked up at him. "This is what happens when we pretend the dark side is just an enemy and not a wound." Neither spoke after that. There was nothing else to say. The tomb was real, not because of the artifacts, not because of the teachings, because it showed them what they were both running from. Zhao, the legacy of a Jedi order that kept losing itself. Red, the shadow of a Sith line that never learned when to stop repeating. They weren't looking at enemies, they were looking at consequences. Red destroyed the recordings. One by one, no rage, no ceremony. Zhao let him. He didn't offer to help. Some things had to be done in silence. When it was over, they left the way they came. The hatch sealed behind them, and neither turned back. They didn't speak until they reached the surface. Even then, it wasn't a conversation. It was a confession. Red looked at the rising light and said, "They weren't the enemy." Zhao didn't ask who was, because he already knew. It wasn't the cult, it wasn't the fire. It was the blindness that let them grow in the first place. And both of them had worn that blindness once. Now, they saw. And what they saw wasn't something they could face alone again. They stayed on Iktoch for 3 days, not because they had to, because neither of them rushed to leave. Red made no camp. Zhao didn't meditate. They sat on opposite ends of the same ridge, overlooking the smoldering ruins of the Spiral Flames compound. The cult was gone, but the echo wasn't. Red felt it in the Force. Not loud, not dark, just wounded. The planet had seen death, but now it held something else. Clarity. Zhao was the first to speak. That chamber, the one underground, It reminded me of something. Red didn't look at him. What? The Jedi archives, Zhao said. The older parts, where no one goes anymore. Red almost smiled. Then maybe they've already forgotten what's coming. Zhao shook his head. No. They remember. They just don't want to feel it. Red turned slightly. Not to argue. Just to see the truth in his eyes. Zhao continued. I think that's why we lose, Jedi, Sith, everyone. We think history is meant to be guarded or erased. But maybe it's only meant to be carried. Red looked back toward the ruins. I've carried too much. That's why you can't let it go, Zhao said softly. There was no judgment in his voice. Just fact. They didn't debate what came next. There was no mission. No command from above. No Sith doctrine to fulfill. No Jedi code to obey. Only two men who had walked into the same fire and left it still standing. The next attack came at dusk. Not from the cult, from one of the warbands left behind by the one Sith scavengers in red armor, drawn by the signal that Red and Zhao had followed. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They opened fire. Zhao ignited his saber. Red unsheathed his, and for the first time, they fought back to back. Not because they trusted each other, because the galaxy didn't give them the choice. Blades spun through smoke and scream. Shots ricocheted through fading light. The air cracked with heat and fury. But there was rhythm. Red fought with precision, Zhao with grace. They didn't need to speak. They knew where each other would move, where to strike, where to fall back. When the last soldier dropped, they stood in the silence again, chest rising, weapons dimming, eyes scanning what no longer needed to be feared. Zhao stepped back. Red didn't move. I thought you were done following me, the Sith said. Zhao shrugged slightly. I was. Then the galaxy made us fight together. Red turned to him. Do you think this is peace? No, Zhao said. This is survival. They both stared at the smoke. Then Red asked something he hadn't asked anyone in years. What happens when survival ends? Zhao didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, looked out into the stars, breaking through the dusk sky. Then we choose who we are. Red stared at him, longer than before, and said nothing, because he didn't have to. The Jedi wasn't offering redemption. The Sith wasn't offering alliance. But somewhere in between, something unspoken was building. Not trust, not hope, respect, earned in fire, forged in silence, held by two warriors the galaxy had already forgotten how to name. And as they walked away from the battlefield, together, but not side by side, the Force didn't judge them. It simply watched. And for once, it did not choose. The uprising did not end with a grand battle. It ended the way all false things end, quietly, slowly, under the weight of their own emptiness. Red didn't strike down the leaders of the pretender sects. Not most of them. He didn't need to. Their movements broke apart long before he reached them. Their alliances shattered. Their followers scattered like ash. Because a myth built on borrowed power has no spine, the spiral flame had fallen on Iktoch. The red echoes dissolved after their leader vanished. The cults using Red's crest turned on each other, each claiming to be the true heir to a legacy Red never created. He watched them collapse from a distance, not because he wanted to, because he had nothing left to chase. Some worlds celebrated the end of the violence. Others didn't even realize it had begun. The galaxy had so many wars, so many rebellions, so many shadows claiming to be destiny, that his myth was just another lost fire. fading in the wind. And Red felt something strange. As the last fragments of the false uprising crumbled, he felt nothing. No triumph. No relief. Just emptiness. Because their fall wasn't his victory. It was their failure. Their weakness. Their hunger to use the dark side as a story instead of a discipline. Their obsession with wearing a mask they hadn't earned. He had once believed silence could protect him. Now he realized silence had created them. Without a voice, they had filled the void with their own. On the dust fields of Uvedian, he found their final battleground. A fortress half-built, flags torn, bodies of zealots lying where they had fought each other. Long before any enemy arrived, there had been no army, no Jedi, no Republic strike force, just paranoia, devouring its masters. Red walked through the ruins with slow steps, boots against dirt, breath echoing inside the cracked helmet, the Force still whispering with the faintest residue of the fear they carried. One corpse still held a banner, his mask painted in red, surrounded by crude symbols of fire. He picked it up, looked at it, then let it fall. He didn't destroy it. It had already destroyed itself. Rumors spread across the sectors. The Red Rebellion has collapsed. The Sith resurgence was a lie. The fires burned out, and the galaxy moved on. There were new threats, new wars, new names shouted in fear. Red became old news, a myth fading at the edges. A warning parents stopped telling their children, a shadow replaced by newer, louder terrors. He watched the galaxy forget him. It didn't hurt. It felt familiar. Everything he had ever known had tried to erase him. The loyalists, the one Sith, the cults, the false believers, the galaxy simply joined the pattern. Zhao Assam crossed paths with him once during those final days. Only once. They didn't speak, didn't fight, didn't stand together, just saw each other, across an abandoned landing field. As the fires of another failed, uprising smoldered behind them. Zhao's expression held quiet understanding. Red's held nothing at all. They nodded, then walked away in different directions. Not as allies, not as enemies, just as two men who knew the war they shared was ending without glory. Red disappeared from the outer rim soon after. No sightings, no signals, no rumors. Even the Force felt less disturbed by his presence. The shadows had fallen, the myth had died, and the galaxy didn't notice. Because the truth was simple. Red didn't destroy the uprising. It destroyed itself. And he simply survived it. Like he survived everything. He was no one's weapon now. The cults had fallen. The name of Darth Wredd was fading. And still, they came for him. Not Jedi, not Sith, not even bounty hunters. Worse, people who once claimed to serve him. Red hadn't called them, hadn't led them. But now, as the myth unraveled, they turned on him, because they needed someone to blame for what they had become. He found their marks scrawled into old temples, their names whispered on backwater comms. They blamed him for their scars, their shame, their surrender. And when they found him, they came not with questions, but with rage. The first duel came on an old ore platform near Bastion. A survivor of the Flame sect, once a child preacher, now wearing cracked crimson armor, burned with his own failed power. "You left us," he said. "You used us." Red didn't answer. He didn't explain that he'd never led them. Didn't remind the man that loyalty built on illusion wasn't loyalty at all. He just fought. The battle was fast, not clean, Red took a cut to the ribs, but he didn't kill the man. He let him live, and when the man screamed that he would return, Red walked away. Because the truth had landed, even his enemies no longer saw him. They saw what they wanted to see: a betrayer, a god, a ghost, a mistake, and in that mistake they placed their blame. Red remembered something his false master once told him. Power is not a throne, it's a target. The moment you stand still, everyone starts aiming. Back then, he thought it was a threat. Now, he saw the truth. He wasn't hunted for what he had done. He was hunted because he was still standing. When everything else had burned, when the cults turned on themselves, when even the Jedi stepped back into silence, Red remained, and that terrified people. Because survival is louder than prophecy, he moved through forgotten systems, changed ships often, sometimes walked alone on planets that still wore the scars of Sith wars long past. He wore no crest, no code, no mask, not anymore. The last time he put it on, it cracked when he breathed. He didn't fix it. He buried it in the sand, on a nameless moon, lit by a dying sun. No one watched. There was no ritual, no goodbye, just a man letting go of something he'd never truly become. And still, the Force followed him, not as thunder, not as flame, as whisper, soft, faint, present. The Force didn't name him Sith anymore. It didn't name him at all. He remembered the eyes of Jawa Sam. Not judgment, not pity, just recognition. And somewhere deep inside, Red began to wonder, not what he had become, but what he had never been allowed to be. A warrior without chains, a fighter without prophecy, a survivor without debt. No banners, no followers, no more betrayals. The last real betrayal wasn't by the cults, or the Sith, or the Jedi. It was by the galaxy, for asking him to carry a name it never earned. Now he walked without one. He had no master, no students, no future, but he had breath, and motion, and silence. And in that silence, he wasn't afraid, because fear belongs to those still trying to matter. Red wasn't. Not anymore. He was just the one who remained. He didn't vanish all at once. It happened slowly, deliberately, without drama. Red moved into the deep fringe. Uncharted sectors where even smugglers kept their distance. No war, no doctrine, no echoes of the Sith name that had followed him for years. He welcomed the silence, because silence didn't ask questions, didn't expect him to speak, didn't demand he justify a life written in blood. He kept his lightsaber, but he never ignited it. Not once. It stayed at his side, not as a weapon, but as a memory. The hilt had no markings. The color was long since faded from his thoughts. All he remembered was the sound it made, the first time it was used, a scream of light. Now, it was quiet. He wore no armor, only faded robes scavenged from forgotten outposts. He wrapped his wrists in cloth to hide the scars, and sometimes he spoke to no one. For months at a time, there were moments when he forgot the sound of his own voice, and that, too, was peace. On a frost-covered world with no name, he found an ancient outpost. Republic once, then Sith, then nothing. He made no home there, just rested, lit a fire in a rusted chamber, watched sparks dance on the walls, where names had been carved and lost. He ran his fingers over the markings. He didn't recognize any, but the ghosts they left behind, he understood them. There was one message, burned faintly into metal. No one remembers the ones who lived. He stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed. Soft, quiet, empty. Because it was true. The galaxy remembered martyrs, legends, explosions, but not the ones who simply endured. Red didn't want to be remembered. He just wanted to rest. He took his saber into the snow and buried it beneath a broken transmitter. No ceremony, no marker. He pressed his palm to the frozen ground and let it go. When he stood, he felt no lighter, just still. He didn't need the weapon anymore, because he no longer needed to fight for what had already left him. Not the Sith, not the cause, not even the anger. He walked beyond the ridge that night, beneath a violet sky choked with stars. And in the quiet breath between steps, the Force whispered again. Not loud, not sharp, just presence. He didn't answer. He had nothing left to give it. He wasn't its servant or its enemy. He was just a part. Sometimes he remembered faces. Jawa Sam, the false Sith who turned on him, the masters who trained him in shadows, the followers who used his name, the children who died believing he'd save them, the galaxy that never once asked who he really was. All of them blurred together into silence, and that silence was the first thing that ever truly belonged to him. Red didn't find peace. He found absence. And in that absence, he buried the last part of himself that still believed he could change anything. No throne, no temple, no end. Just breath and silence and the snow covering the last thing he ever called a weapon. He had no throne, no temple, no apprentice to whisper his name. The galaxy turned without him. New alliances formed, new wars began, and the myth of the Sith, his myth, became a footnote. But Red was not dead. He watched it all from far beyond the known lanes, seated beneath the twin moons of a forgotten system, his silhouette still, his presence muted. He felt the tremors in the Force, not as storms, but as echoes. He saw the rise of new pretenders, false Sith with louder names, shorter reigns, and emptier hearts. They didn't scare him. They didn't impress him. They screamed louder because they didn't understand silence. Red understood it too well. There was no monument where he rested, no shrine, no datapad recording his deeds, no Jedi Council debating his legacy, no Sith holocron with his teachings, just dust and wind and the quiet thrum of a life that refused to end. He watched holofeeds on old receivers, sometimes days late, sometimes never. He didn't care about accuracy. He only watched to see if anyone remembered. They didn't. And somehow, that was comforting. To be forgotten was to be free. But the Force didn't forget. It lingered around him, soft and patient, not as an ally, not as a judge, just there. And in that quiet presence, Red found something stranger than rage, something deeper than revenge. Acceptance, not peace. He wasn't made for peace, but he was done fighting what had already died. When storms came, he let them pass. When old enemies resurfaced in whispers, he stayed where he was. Because he knew the truth, the galaxy had never needed him. Not as a savior, not as a threat, only as a name to blame when it feared itself. Now, that need was gone, and what was left was something rare. A Sith who didn't burn, didn't collapse, didn't explode in prophecy. Just one who watched and waited, not for revenge, not for redemption. For nothing. He remembered Jao Assam's last words, a quiet promise in a ruined hall. You could be more. And Red had replied, with no anger, no, I could be less. That was the last truth he ever spoke aloud. Years passed. The Force shifted again. New legends rose. New names filled the void. And through it all, Red remained, not a figure of power, not a symbol of fear, just the one who survived. He did not die. He did not return. He simply endured, until endurance became myth. Some say a shadow walks the edge of wild space, watching ships drift past, without ever answering hails. Others say a figure in tattered robes once stood at the edge of a Jedi enclave and left before anyone saw him clearly. But those are only stories, and Red is done with stories. He lives only in the silence between them, not written, not spoken, not claimed. The Sith who watched the end and asked for no part of it. There is no monument to Darth Wredd, not on Coruscant, not in the archives of Ossus, not in the hushed libraries of Sith ruins, where names like Bane, Nihilus, and Crate still linger in cursed breath. No carvings, no tomb, no records etched into holocrons glowing red in vaults of hatred. The galaxy does not remember him, and that is exactly why he mattered. Because Red did not want to be remembered. He wanted to be heard once, then disappear. He was born in silence, raised in shadows, and when he stood before the legacy of the Sith, he broke it with nothing more than rejection. He didn't scream. He didn't conquer. He didn't build an empire to carry his name. He let it fall, and he walked away, and in doing so, he ended something older than most Jedi knew how to measure. Not with fire, but with distance. The Sith always expected their legacy to be eternal, inscribed into fear, preserved in cruelty, taught through blood and dominance. But Red proved something else. That legacy does not need to echo. If it was never built to last, he was never the strongest, never the most feared, never the one the galaxy gathered behind. But somehow, in the cracks left by fallen orders and shattered thrones, his absence became louder than their presence. Because every whisper about him ended the same way. I don't know what he wanted. I don't think he followed the code. I don't even think he believed in the Sith. And that was the point. Red didn't want the Sith to die in battle. He wanted them to die in meaning. He never wrote a doctrine. He never preached to students. He left no rule of two, no new law to bind power, only silence. And silence is hard to follow. So the galaxy didn't. And when it looked for statues, there were none, only whispers. Old smugglers recalling a man who could have killed them but didn't. Jedi masters wondering why their fallen students stopped hearing darkness. War profiteers confused why the Sith movement just stopped. No great defeat, no cataclysm, no chosen one, just stillness, where the fire should have burned. That is where Red succeeded. Not in death, not in victory, in ending the cycle, by stepping away from it. The Sith died twice, once with Crate, once with Red. The first was thunder, the second wind, and in many ways, the wind is what finally empties a battlefield. There were some who searched for him, hoped to find a place where he was buried, a relic, a trail, anything, but they found nothing, because he left nothing. Even the Force, which had followed him like a shadow, grew quiet when it spoke his name, as if unsure whether it had ever truly held him. And maybe that's what Red became in the end, A whisper the Force couldn't classify. Not light, not dark, not balance, just the sound of a door closing, without anger. And in that closing, the story of the Sith, for the first time in generations, stopped writing itself. The Sith believed power was meant to be passed down, through fear, through trials, through rules written in blood, and spoken in whispers between generations of betrayal. But Red never passed anything down, because he never wanted to. He didn't see the Sith as a religion, or a destiny. He saw it as a trap, made from dead voices, repeating the same promise. You will be greater than the one who taught you. But that promise came with chains. Chains of vengeance. Chains of pride. Chains of loyalty to a war long lost. Between ghosts who called themselves lords. Red broke those chains not with fire, but with emptiness. He never took an apprentice, never taught, never created a holocron to whisper his thoughts into the ears of the next monster. Because he didn't want monsters to follow him. He didn't want to be the next step in anything. He wanted to be the last one who stepped away. The Sith code spoke of freedom through passion, through strength, through victory. But Red read those words and heard something else, not truth. Addiction. The addiction to conflict, to legacy, to being seen. Red didn't need to be seen. He didn't crave recognition. He didn't want someone to name a blade after him, or carve his mask into the walls of a broken temple. He wanted silence, because silence meant it ended with him, and that was enough. He studied the ancient texts of Darth Bane. He read the lost doctrines of Nihilus and Revan. He saw how each one, in their own way, believed they had solved the Sith, made it stronger, more pure, more efficient. But all of them, every last one, left a trail that led to war. And war always led back to the Jedi. And the Jedi always led back to the lie that the Sith were the opposite of peace. Red didn't see opposites. He saw echoes. The Jedi built temples. The Sith destroyed them. The Jedi trained students. The Sith corrupted them. The Jedi feared power. The Sith consumed it, but it was all the same. A mirror, reflecting fear. He didn't want to reflect anymore. He didn't want to become a legend to be debated by Jedi historians or Sith zealots. He wanted to be unspoken, a Sith without doctrine, without students, without ears, because in the end, the clearest rebellion is to leave nothing behind for others to repeat. He lived that truth until the last day he walked in sunlight, until even the Force stopped whispering instructions. He didn't ask for absolution. He didn't meditate for balance. He didn't beg the galaxy to understand. He just left the teachings behind, like a robe in the sand, and walked forward until there were no more voices to follow or resist. Just breath, just ground beneath his feet, and the strange, quiet freedom of being no one's legacy, not even his own. Names are supposed to shape destiny. Sith names more than most. Darth Bane, Darth Malgus, Darth Great. Names that carried doctrine, carried heirs, carried the weight of entire wars. But Darth Wredd never carried anything. Not legacy, not prophecy, not even belief. His name meant nothing when he chose it. He didn't earn it in ritual, didn't inherit it from a master, didn't claim it after killing a rival lord. He took the title for one reason only, to stop someone else from using it as a lie. And in doing so, he ended its meaning. Because a Sith name is supposed to be a banner, something that gathers power, summons fear, shapes the future. But Redd's name didn't grow. It collapsed, not through weakness, but through refusal. Every time someone tried to follow him, he broke their cause. Every time someone tried to claim him, he erased the path behind him. Every time someone said Darth Wredd like a prophecy, he vanished into silence, until the prophecy suffocated under its own weight. The Sith code was clear. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. Wredd lived each line backward. Through silence, he denied passion. Through denial, he avoided strength. Through avoidance, he rejected power. Through rejection, he refused victory. And through refusal, he broke the chain entirely, not by pulling it apart, simply by walking away from it. The galaxy didn't understand. The Jedi thought he was in hiding. The Sith remnants thought he was planning something. The cults thought he was waiting for the right moment. But Wredd wasn't waiting. He wasn't planning. He wasn't rising. He was fading. By choice. The one Sith fell because of their greed. The old Sith fell because of their pride. Crate fell because he could not share power. Bane fell because he could not escape his own rule. But Wredd ended the Sith because he didn't want the power that kept them alive. One man who refused to become the next link in the chain. One name that refused to echo. He unwrote the code, simply by being the first Sith who didn't need it. And so the galaxy forgot him. Because how do you remember a man who didn't want to be remembered? How do you record a legacy built from silence? How do you follow a figure who never turned around to see if you were following? You don't. You move on. And the Sith, after thousands of years of shaping war, shaping fear, shaping history, finally moved on too. Not because the Jedi destroyed them, not because the Force demanded balance, but because one man refused to let their teachings continue. He didn't proclaim a new age, didn't announce an ending, didn't stand above a shattered temple. He just stopped, and the galaxy, with nothing left to imitate, let the Sith fade with him. A name that unmade a doctrine, a shadow that ended a belief, not through power, but through absence, not through victory, but through choice, not through death, but through survival, quiet, unclaimed, complete. The galaxy never learned when Darth Wredd's story ended. No battle marked his fall. No monument marked his resting place. No record announced his final breath. History only noticed he was gone. When it realized it no longer felt afraid of him. But that was the point. Wredd didn't want his end to matter. He didn't want a legacy. He didn't want a final stand written into the Jedi archives, or carved into some forgotten Sith vault. He wanted silence, and he got it. He spent his last years in the deep fringe, a region so empty. Even the Force seemed to echo before it reached him. He wandered between dead moons and ice worlds, never staying long, never watching the same sunrise twice. Not because he was hunted, not because he feared being found, but because he didn't know how to stand still anymore. Standing still felt like wearing the mask again, like letting the galaxy decide what he was. Movement was freedom. Silence was peace. Solitude was the only truth he had never been taught, but had learned on his own. He didn't look like a Sith anymore. No armor, no mask, just a worn cloak, and eyes that had seen every reason the galaxy had to destroy itself. Sometimes he crossed paths with travelers. They didn't know him. He didn't tell them. He helped them fix engines, moved debris from crash sites, warned them away from dangerous systems. Small things, quiet things. Acts of a man who had forgotten he once carried a red blade. One child asked him once, in a voice unbroken by fear, "Are you a Jedi?" He shook his head. "A Sith." Another shake. "Then what are you?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he finally understood. "I'm just passing through," he said. And the child accepted that answer, far more easily than the galaxy ever had. When he finally felt his age, not in his body, but in his breath, he found a world with no name, a place untouched by war, untouched by history, untouched by him. He walked into a valley of broken crystal spires and sat beneath a stone overhang that shielded him from the wind. There was no vision, no prophecy, no voice from the Force calling him into light or dragging him into darkness. Just quiet, a quiet he had earned, a quiet he had never been given, a quiet that felt like the first honest moment of his life. Red didn't close his eyes immediately. He watched the sky lighten, watched the air shift, watched the last shadows of night fade into something softer than dawn. He wasn't waiting for death. He was waiting for nothing. Because nothing was the end he had chosen. Not sacrifice, not power, not recognition. Nothing. And in that nothing, the Sith truly ended. Not with fire, not with conquest, not with the victory of Jedi or the collapse of empires. They ended because the last one who carried the name refused to pass it on. The galaxy continued. Wars rose and ended. New heroes came and went. New darknesses learned to crawl. But none of them called themselves Darth Wredd, because the man who owned that name took it with him into silence. Maybe he died there. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he simply became another whisper in the Force that never claimed him. But his legacy, the one he never wanted, remains. Not in monuments, not in teachings, not in power, in the truth that ended everything. A Sith can choose to stop, and when one does, the rest fall quiet behind him,